All right, hello guys. Welcome to our DiSE session this evening. As advertised, we're joined by a special guest who is not only just a top coach, but he's also become a really good friend of mine. And I really wanted to get Ben onto one of our DiSE sessions, and this is the perfect one for Ben to help us out with. So tonight we're looking at real-time risk assessment for cyclists. Now, there is already a video that we have created specifically for the risk assessment workbook, okay? But there's a section at the end of that workbook where you have to complete a risk assessment task, okay? In our video that we've already made and we've put up on YouTube, we don't really go into too much detail on how you do that task, and so tonight's session is all about that. Okay, so I'll start off by introducing Ben. So we're joined by Ben Scaife. Ben is he's got lots of different roles. He's a British cycling coach. He's one of the coaches on our DiSE Tenerife camps. He's a media content creator for BC. Founder of Scaife CC, which you guys can check out after the session tonight. He's an expedition organizer and a leader. He's a mountain biker. He's the producer and presenter of Roll the Dice podcast, which I'm hoping you guys are watching because it's perfect for you guys and it's specifically designed for you. And that's only been going since October 2024. And I've also missed something out actually because Ben is also a reservist for the Royal Navy. So yeah, he's pretty busy. Okay, so the fact that we've got Ben on tonight is absolutely fantastic, and he's given up a bit of time to come and help us out on here. So amazing. Ben, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, it's quite the introduction there. And a nice mugshot. So yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah,
it's a few familiar names as well, which is good.
That's right. That's a mugshot that I took, so I was quite pleased with it at the time, but you didn't like it, did you?
It does the job. Yeah, it does the job.
I thought it was very good. Yeah. Palm trees in the background. We mentioned the Roll the Dice podcast. Tell us about the podcast, Ben, because it's your podcast.
Oh, it's a joint venture, but those of you who are out in Tenerife with us probably saw a bit of it being made, but it was quite an on-the-fly thing at first, but there is some good content in there amongst a bit of waffle, but quite a lot that's aimed at covering off some of the stuff you will see on the DiSE syllabus, but in various formats. So sometimes it's in the team car, sometimes it's in the hotel, sometimes it's at Lisa's hotel. But it's a bit of an insight for those of you who maybe haven't been on one of the Tenerife training camps yet, but would like to in the future. Yeah, it's a good tool for both DiSE and what we do on the training camps.
And how do they find it, Ben?
The training camp?
No, the podcast.
How did they find it?
No, how will they find it? So if you're on here now and you're thinking, right, I need to listen to that podcast, where do I go to find it?
Yeah, either YouTube my name, or if you actually type in Roll the Dice podcast, I believe it does just come up in the results now, which is quite good.
I think we've done 7 episodes, haven't we?
Yeah, there's a lot. So
yeah. Okay, episode number 8 yet to be recorded, but I've got some ideas on that. But anyway, let's move on. So our objectives for this session are very specific actually. This is totally geared around the last section of the assessing risk workbook. Okay, so by the end of this session, you guys should be able to recognize common risks encountered during training and racing, evaluate these risks using a mental risk assessment framework, and then apply a mitigation strategy. Now, that might sound very wordy and very far removed from anything that any of you ever do. But if we take this picture here to start off with, Ben, can you explain to us how that 3-step, or those 3 objectives, if you like, how do they fit in with this picture here that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to guess that's Fort William, British Downhill Series. It's a good photo. But basically, by the end of the session, we are going to be looking at the kind of paperwork table format of risk assessing. But the idea behind that is you may encounter that if you go on to do something like coaching, or you work as support staff in sport rather than being an athlete. A lot of the behind the scenes as a coach does look like that table paperwork format. But for you as riders, people who are looking to turn pro or race at an elite level, we want you to take away from this using that as a framework. So not necessarily filling in a clipboard as you're riding along during a race. That's not practical at all or useful. But how can we use that framework to basically have a mental process? So it's a bit like the same process that your brain makes to take decisions, quick decisions, but decisions that are thought through to the end of the scenario. So similar to that.
Okay, so a real-time risk assessment then. So as Ben was mentioning there, you guys are going to be working through a kind of paper version of this, but the whole point of this really is the paper version is really illustrative of the way you should be thinking about assessing risks when you're on the bike. Okay, cycling is an inherently dangerous sport. Okay, especially when you factor in things like traffic. But then when you look at certain disciplines where there's no traffic, so for instance downhill, obviously the severity of accidents, the severity of the outcomes of an accident, can be, well, fatal. So I want to kind of reiterate at this point, because I'm always kind of harping on about what DiSE is about. DiSE is about making the bike go faster. And although risk assessment could sound like really dry, it's actually one of the most important aspects of becoming a top level bike rider, because if you cannot stay out of danger, if you cannot stay safe, and if you crash often, and if you crash badly, then it will quickly cut your career very, very short, or worse. Okay, or worse. And so what I don't want you guys to be thinking is, this is just like, we've done risk assessment in GCSE PE, and it was like, where are the fire exits, and like, what, how do you get in and out of the changing rooms if there's a fire? It's not about that. Okay, it's about, you're on the bike, you're dealing with a very, very dynamic environment. Okay, which means a changing environment, and you are responsible for your own safety. And in certain types of cycling, your actions impact the safety of other riders as well. Okay, so this is massively, massively important for your career. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through a 4-step process where we identify the hazard, we evaluate the likelihood of the hazard. In other words, how probable is it that this hazard we've identified might happen? Then we evaluate the severity. So how bad would it be if that did happen? And then mitigation strategy, which basically means what can we do to reduce the risk? Okay. So Ben, if you could talk us through this kind of basic idea first of all.
Yeah, so this is the most common format / framework that you're going to see for risk assessing. But the way Nick had it in bullet point format was quite good when we're talking about doing it mentally. So if you're writing it down, then obviously it's always going to go in a table like this. Mentally, though, this is probably quite a good way to go from left to right if you're processing something in real time. So hazard, obviously down the side there, you've got some examples of hazards, but what is the danger immediately ahead of you? Likelihood is a difficult one to evaluate because we mentioned a little bit of this on the podcast, but likelihood is largely dictated by the environment you're in. What I mean by that is you can't really decide on how likely it is for something to happen. That's just dictated about sort of what's going on around you. Okay, so the example we used on the podcast was a car pulling out in front of you mid-effort, for example. It's not very likely on the side of a mountain where it's one long straight road and you can see for miles, but it's highly likely in a town centre or an area with a lot of junctions. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of when you're evaluating the likelihood, that is just you deciding depending on the environment you're in. So how likely is it to happen based off what's going on around you? Severity is the thing you can control. This usually goes from, and we'll talk about some numeric scales later, but low consequence, you're going to brush it off, it's a scratch or a bruise, to, unfortunately, like Nick said, death, fatality, very serious injury. the things we want to avoid. And we'll talk about, mitigation in a bit more detail as well. But mitigation is just basically the action you take to reduce the risk. And it's not always getting rid of the risk, because we can talk about how we employ this tactically in a racing scenario. It's about reducing it to a level that you're comfortable with. And it boils down to the phrase, risk it for the biscuit. How much risk are you willing to accept? Is there a reward, e.g. a biscuit at the end of it? If there's not, you should probably have quite a low risk tolerance. If it's a big race and you need to make the gap, then your tolerance to risk is going to be much higher. But that's up for you to decide and then take some actions to mitigate the risk.
Okay, so these are the 4 steps then, okay, that Ben just mentioned earlier there. So identifying a hazard, evaluating the likelihood, evaluating the severity, mitigation strategy. So it's at its most simplest form of risk assessment. It's these 4 steps, isn't it, Ben?
Yeah, exactly. And I think when we go on to putting this into a table format and we add some numbers, I want everyone to start thinking of steps 3 and 4 being slightly linked, because the actions we take to mitigate a risk directly impact how severe it exists, basically. The more mitigations you take, i.e. you start removing more bits of risk, the severity comes down. The likelihood stays the same largely, but the severity comes down.
Right. Let's move on then. So we've gone through this. Okay, this is another example of a risk assessment table, but this is what it looks like without any kind of numerical information. Okay, so at the moment, this is probably something that we might think about. So, for example, this is a good one, potholes ahead, because the whole of the UK seems to be covered in potholes, doesn't it? So, there's potholes ahead, like likelihood of that, well, yeah, completely possible. Severity, so the likelihood of, crashing on a pothole was, it's possible. The severity, moderate. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to scan the road surface and avoid potholes. It sounds obvious, okay, but that is what we do. And I've been out cycling with people who were relatively new to the sport, and they don't do this. And I've seen people crash because they've hit a pothole, and they either weren't looking out for it, or they didn't think potholes existed because they drive everywhere. These things do happen. So. Although it might seem obvious to us, it's actually something that we do. But what we're going to aim to do today is take that another level further, so that we can, we can evaluate, risks in a more kind of, high pressure situation. Okay, like a race environment. So Ben, what do these numbers mean?
There's some good word descriptors on there which make it quite obvious. Usually 1 to 5 is used on paper risk assessments, but in your head you should be sort of evaluating this more like the word format. So from very unlikely to highly likely. It's usually measured in sort of, very unlikely would be 1 in a million. Very likely would be something like 1 in 10 or 1 in 100, as in the possibility of this risk happening. So 1 out of 10 times the hazard will exist, and it will be a risk, compared to 1 in a million. And then severity is just a sliding scale from, like we said, cuts and bruises up to fatality and serious injuries. When you're doing this in your head, you're probably not going to rate it sort of in the number format. You're probably going to use the word description in your decision making process, which we'll talk about a bit later. But then you basically times them together. So, for example, 5 times 5 is a very, very high risk. It's 25 out of 25. It's intolerable. But there's a scale down the right-hand side there. So this is where you start to put this in a racing context, and almost before you, as part of your mental preparations for a bike race, thinking tactically, you have to decide what level of risk is acceptable. Are you going to follow someone's wheel who's sort of like chopping all over the place, or is descending at an unreasonable speed? Only you can decide that, and whether this event is important enough to warrant you accepting a higher level of risk. So yes, we're putting this on paperwork, but always relate this back to how it can be a tactical advantage in racing. If you're switched on and the rest of the peloton or the race isn't, which is often for juniors, this will give you a tactical edge.
So just as an example, then the way these numbers work. So let's say, for instance, we're assessing a risk, and the likelihood of this particular risk happening is a 4, and if it does happen, then it's the severity would be a 5. So Ben, can you imagine a scenario in cycling where the likelihood of a risk is 4 and the severity would be a 5?
Yeah, I'm going to go for mountain bike context because that is my domain. Let's say something like it is highly likely you will encounter a berm on the upcoming trail, but the other side of this berm, it might be somewhere like Revs or Glencoe, is basically a cliff. Like you're falling for quite a fair distance, and so the outcome of that would be a 5.
So
like serious damage.
So if we took 4 and we multiplied it by 5, that brings us out where on the risk rating?
High or intolerable. Yeah.
Right. So 4 times 5 puts us over here, doesn't it? Yeah. So that's how these numbers relate to these numbers here. So we multiply the likelihood by the severity, and it gives us the risk rating. Correct? Yeah.
Exactly. And start to think about this, like we said, in a racing scenario. I'm sure we're going to talk about this, Nick, but how do we change the risk outcome? It is always likely to encounter a berm on the upcoming trail. We can't change the likelihood, but there is something else we can change about it, which we'll talk about. Start thinking.
All right, let's move on then. So here's one example scenario just to illustrate. Okay, and so this is an example of a medium risk. Okay, so I'll just go through this one quickly, and then Ben's going to go through an intolerable risk one. So let's say, for instance, this is road cycling, wet road surface. So likelihood of crashing on a wet road surface. Let's say it's like a city centre crit or something like that. So the likelihood of that happening is 4. The severity is 3. So that would be like potentially more than 3 days of absence. That means more than 3 days of absence from training, okay, or environmental damage. We're not worried about environmental damage, okay, but that's something that might be relevant in another context. But we're more concerned in terms of what's going to happen to us. So more than 3 days absence of off the bike, okay. So if we take 4, we multiply it by 3, then 12. So that's a medium risk. Okay. So if we go back to this table, okay, 12 is a medium risk. So action is required. So if we go back to that table, that means some action is required. So for example, we might slow down. We might avoid braking sharply. The example I gave in the podcast, if you watch the 2023 Road World Championships, the elite men's race, Matthias Skjelmoser actually stops on the finishing circuits to let some air out of his tyres, okay, which is an example of action being taken to avoid the likelihood of crashing. So that's one example of where we can tolerate that risk, and we might have to do something about it to mitigate it. But what's going on here, Ben?
Okay, yeah, let's have a little look then. Poor visibility due to fog. Double 5s is 25. It's right up intolerable. Now, obviously, you might look at this and go, well, what are we going to do? There's not really anything we can do about this if it's high risk. Or some people might be sat there thinking, well, high risk, high reward, we're going to do it anyway. What you should be thinking about when the risk is intolerable is how much risk am I willing to tolerate, and how can I get it down to that level? So maybe this is an important race to me and I'm willing to tolerate quite a high level of risk. Well, how am I going to change this? Bring down the severity or reduce the likelihood. And we said the likelihood is fairly dictated by your environment. The severity is something you can control. So if you watch the podcast we talked about, for example, fog, right? An easy way you could reduce the severity of this a bit is by either reducing some speed or sticking lights on your bike if this wasn't a race. It may still be worth you taking that risk and having a 3 or 4 severity. But if a risk is intolerable to you, then you need to start thinking about, like it says there, immediate action. Either cease the activity, for example, if it was a training ride, or take immediate steps to reduce the severity. So just because it's in a high level of risk doesn't mean we're not going to do it. It just means some mitigations need to be put in place by you as a rider. And Nick mentioned this before, but at the end of the day, you have to look after number one, especially in something like cycling. It is a team sport at times, but largely your safety is down to you and you alone, even when there's other people around you that are affecting how risky it is. Because at the end of the day, if they crash into you and you go off the side of the hill, it's you who misses out. So that's the most important thing about risk assessment, is looking after number one, especially when we're thinking about this career-wise.
Okay, so I think at this stage, now's a good time for everyone on the call to actually have a go at doing this. And what I want you guys to do, or what we want you guys to do, is to use the chat on Teams for this, okay? So that we can look at everyone's examples and we can give everyone a little bit of feedback. So what we want you to do is choose one, one typical risk scenario from your cycling discipline. Okay, so we've got people who do downhill, we've got people who do track, road, cross, the lot. Okay, so we want a big variety, or BMX as well. So choose one typical risk from your cycling discipline and then complete the risk assessment steps to evaluate the risk rating, and then tell us what your action will be. Okay, so to give you like a visual prompt, if I go back to this slide, okay, actually, no, I'll go back to this one. This is probably more helpful. Okay, so you need to identify a risk in your cycling discipline, and then you have to assess the likelihood of that happening, the severity of if it does happen, and then use the likelihood by the times the severity to come up with a risk rating, describe the action level, and then tell us what action you take. Okay, it's important to describe the scenario. I think, as Ben has been making really clear, the context of the scenario is really, really important. Okay, if it's foggy and you've got a training session, then clearly you don't train in the fog. But if it's a race and the race is on, if the commissaires have decided that race is on, then it's on. It's down to you to decide what action to take at that point. So the scenario is really, really important. So what we don't want you to do is to say, example, cornering on a wet road or cornering on a wet descent. Tell us what someone's got their mic on. Tell us what the scenario is as well, because that's really, really important. Okay, because without the scenario, it doesn't really make sense. So we're going to give you about 5, 6, 7 minutes to do this. Okay, we'll judge progress by what we see coming into the chat, and then once everyone's put something into the chat, then we'll go through and we'll start doing a little bit of feedback, and we will get you guys to actually comment on as well on what actions you might be taking. Okay, so over to you guys. I'll leave this slide up for a moment, okay, and we will wait for you to start adding some things to the chat. If anyone's got a question on what it is they need to do, then ask us now. Okay, so you'll have to do this all in one chat, by the way, because if you do it in sections and then send it in each section, then it will just get spread out across the whole of the chat. So type up the whole of your assessment and then press send into the chat. Okay.
Nick, it says my chat is still blocked at the minute, so I'm not sure how to get onto it.
Okay, Keshi, are you on? Did you join through Teams or did you join through the link that I gave you?
I joined through the link.
Okay, Keshi, if you just write something down on on a bit of paper in front of you, and then we'll ask you. You can use the microphone for your one. Okay.
Alright, that's fine. I'll write it down now.
Cool.
Alright, cool.
Right. While we've got a couple coming in, we'll just start giving people feedback on their suggestions. So let's start off with Joe Laidler. So MCB Rock Garden, 4 to 3 or 4 depending on speed or risk of the rock garden, reduced speed. So Ben, what information are we missing on there for a risk assessment?
Yeah, you're gonna have to read these out as we go along because I'm external, so I can't see the chat. But I did get that one. We had a hazard, didn't we, for that one, Joe? Maybe some context. So think about rock gardens in training versus rock gardens in a national series race. And also there's some other factors that would affect your risk assessment there in terms of thinking about racing, so fatigue levels, other riders, if this is cross country, and alternatives, so B and C lines.
Ben, I've just sent you a screenshot of the chat, so I'll send that periodically as we get more coming in. So Joe, on your one there, so you've got 4 and 3. So I'm guessing the 4 is the likelihood and the 3 is the severity. Is that right, Joe? You'll need to put your mic on for this, Joe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, right. So it's either it's 4 times 3 or 4 times 4, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what you need to do in this as well is you need to show us what the risk rating number would be, and then use the action level descriptor. Okay. So so that would be so let's say that's 12, right? That would be a medium risk. Okay. So we'd have to make sure we put the number in there. So the risk rating number and the action level descriptor, the word medium, and then the mitigating strategy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect.
Just a note, guys, on risk rating. Okay, since we're not talking about this in a workplace context where the goal is to reduce risk to an absolute 0, we are talking about this in terms of being elite athletes and accepting that there is a certain level of risk. You may well evaluate the hazard to be a medium or high risk, and your answer could be, I accept that, but provide the context and say why. So for Joe's example, it may be you come out of that with a 12, it's medium risk. Okay, I accept that because this is national champs and I'm willing to accept a slightly higher level of risk because potentially there's a reward there, which could be, creating a gap on someone who's taken the B line or exceeding the sort of pace of someone behind you because you are more skilled or are willing to accept more risk. So it's not always about getting the risk to an absolute zero. It's about deciding how much risk we want to take.
That, that's a really good point, and I've not made that point at all on this actually at any point, and I think it's interesting, isn't it, Ben? Because when you talk about risk assessment in a kind of like in a work environment, because risk assessments happen in work environments all the time, then people are trying to completely eradicate any level of risk, aren't they? But like you've said, cycling is always going to be risky. So we're not trying to eliminate risk. We're trying to reduce it. Okay.
Yeah, this is what separates you guys on the call as DiSE athletes, potential elite athletes, from everyday people. Is if you ever go into the workforce in general and you end up, for example, in an office or some other sort of job, the goal is, that's why risk assessments have a bad rep, because someone says risk assessment and everyone's immediate reaction is, oh, we've all got to tie our shoelaces 4 times and go around the wet floor signs, etc. But no, this is a tool for you all to use to your advantage, almost manipulating the risk and taking risks, because at the end of the day, sometimes taking a risk is the right thing to do.
Let's move on to Megan's one. So I think Megan was after Joe. Yeah. So talk us through that one then, Ben.
Okay, let's have a look. So potholes, identify the hazard. It's likely, especially in the UK, like Nick mentioned. It has a severity of 3, especially if you're following someone's wheel or perhaps carrying a bit more speed. The strategy there is brake before / avoid pothole. Now, put this into a team scenario. If you were out in Tenerife with us, Will's voice by the end of the trip was pretty much gone because he was doing the right thing, communicating. So another strategy could be, pointing out the pothole. Maybe we don't want to slow down because this is a race, right? But the other way we can reduce the risk is by working with other riders in the group, positioning yourself slightly off the wheel. All these things that you can do to reduce the risk whilst, not slowing down, whilst making the bike go faster, right? Thinking outside the box on how to mitigate this risk. So yeah, that's a good example.
Okay, that's a good one. So Arne, if you just open up your microphone for a second there, Arne. So you're BMX, right?
Yeah.
Right. So can you see that on the WhatsApp I sent to you, Ben? Can you see Arne's risk assessment?
That makes a lot more sense now you say BMX, Arne.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a really good one.
Talk us through it, Ben.
Yeah, let's have a look. Wind, like we say, that would be likely is a good assessment, but perhaps on the day you would look at the weather forecast or be stood at the top of the 8-meter hill and figure out just how windy it is. Likely 2 to 3 days of absence or temporary damage. Yeah, especially when you're a good bike rider, you'd like to think the risk is not too severe on that one. Assess the skills you use to go down the straight. If you're going to jump, how you move your body in the air. So yeah, you may. So here's where it gets slightly difficult to describe, but I'm going to try my best in terms of mitigating risk. Right, risk v. There's an extra bit because you're athletes. It's risk v reward on the end. So what you've said there is assess whether you're going to jump and how you move your body in the air. So you may decide to squash all the jumps or race the jumps or not jump at all and manual if it's not gaps. And the guy next to you might decide to jump every single section of the course, but he may well end up crashing. So that's you evaluating, is the risk worth the reward, or might it take you, 1 or 2 seconds longer to do the BMX run, but you got to the finish, you didn't crash on the second straight. So yeah, that's a really good one.
Excellent. All right, and then we've got a cyclocross one next, and I don't think I've sent this one to you, Ben. So I'll do that now. So we've got cyclocross, and this is Nicholas Ollie. So I'm having real difficulty talking and taking a picture at the same time, so I'm going to stop talking while I take this picture.
Multitasking, not a part of DiSE, no.
No, it's not. Certainly not where I'm involved. I can only just do one thing, never mind two. Right, so cyclocross example, finding a slippery corner when sighting the course. That's a 4 likelihood. So likely to fall over. 1 to 2 severity. Risk rating 6. Before the race, I'll put on tyres more suited to the mud and change the tyre pressure to what's needed. I mean, I think to me that sounds like exactly what you see top level, cyclocross riders doing. So, any observations there, Ben?
Yeah, that's really good from Nicholas, because you're starting to think of this in a dynamic context. So what we mean by dynamic is very similar to just static and dynamic in other descriptions. But static risk assessment is like putting it down on the table like this. A dynamic one is exactly what Nicholas has just described, because that might even be a decision you make during the race, and you swap to a pit bike that you've shouted some pressures at whoever's in the pits for you, and you swap to some lower tire pressures, or you go on some different wheels during the race, sort of thing. So think about risk dynamically as well. How does it change? And it might be a risk that changes by the second. It might be a risk that gradually changes as the weather gets worse. So yeah, think of risk assessment as a process that is just constantly going like this in your head, round and round. That's a really good one.
So that's what you mean by dynamically then, Ben? Yeah, it's the fact that risk assessment is ongoing. So you're ongoing the same. You're continually assessing the same risks because it's a changing environment. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. You're not sat at an office that's air conditioned and stays the same all day. Your office is the bike, and things are constantly changing depending on where you are on the course, depending on the environment you're in, depending on how the weather changes. So yeah, it could be a split second change. It could be a gradual change. For example, the course evolves or the weather gets worse. That was a good one. Yeah. Brilliant.
Okay. Lara has got a MTB race or cyclocross race example. So slippery routes, likelihood 3, severity 1, risk rating 3, action avoid the routes. If you have to go over them, be sure not to go over them at an angle and don't use the front brake. If there's a B or a C line, it may be safer on that than risk a crash in a race. Make sense, Ben?
Yeah, and the other one about I like how many mountain biking cross examples we're getting, by the way. But the other one that's good about something like routes is an excellent example, because you may look at it and assess it as quite a low risk. But if you've ever ridden over some routes before, I'm sure you have, this is what you're referencing here. Sometimes it's just totally unpredictable. Like, you can't tell whether it's been scalped or the bark's come off. And they can just be lethal. You don't even have to brake or shift your weight, and it'll throw you off. So you may make the assessment to just take the B line, or take a lower line that has a catching rut in it. Example, just for context, at World Champs in Glasgow, someone on our mountain bike cross-country team slipped on the routes, didn't even crash, just stuck his foot out. Unfortunately, he wasn't riding the bike for the next 2 days of that practice week, because he really twinged a muscle in his back, and that was all it took. And it was quite a wet and muddy day earlier in the week. And so, yeah, potentially that could have been something he avoided by taking a slightly different line where he didn't have to go over the routes. But yeah, something as small as that. And you do want to practice these things in training, but maybe it's always the ifs and buts. But did we have the chance later on in the practice week to do that in the dry, or later in the day when it dried up? And this is risk assessing in context. Is it worth taking that risk? So yeah.
And that's a good example there, Ben, of how it impacts on making the bike go slower, because for 2 days that bike did not move.
It was crazy. Yeah, he didn't even crash. He just sort of stuck his leg out, and unfortunately, yeah, he could barely walk for a few days. So that was a lot of physio, and eventually back on the bike for the race. But yeah, missed out on a bit of course training.
There were a similar example actually. There was a road rider, Australian guy called Matt White, who's now he's now DiSE with Jayco, but he was a rider with he was with the Lance Armstrong's team, US Postal, for a while, and before that he was with a French team called Cofidis, and he'd never ridden the Tour, and he'd been chosen for the Tour that year. This is going back a long way, by the way. We're talking about like 1998. It's a long time ago. But he'd been selected for the Tour, and he was warming up on the morning of the prologue, and he rode over a television cable, because obviously there's TV cables all over the place, like in the start and finish area of the Tour, and he was just like, not doing any speed at all, hit one of these cables, and it took his front wheel, and he was out of the Tour. That was it, game over. So these really kind of like low severity. They can be low severity in terms of like, it's a minor injury. You'll be back in it. You'll be back in a couple of days. But if it's the day before a major race, then depends how you define severity, doesn't it? Really, because it's the impact then is not just the impact on you in terms of your body, but the impact that it's going to have on that stage of your career, right?
Yeah. Here's a just a quick one, just a perspective that I think you should take or start to learn. You might think, listening to what Nick's just said, it's like pedantic. Why you don't want to ride everywhere slow just in case there's a TV cable. But think of it as flicking the switch is like the phrase I've used before with riders. When the switch is on and you're in a race and this risk assessment process is happening rapidly, and you're switched on and you're ready for the risks that are coming, but you're willing to accept a higher level of risk, that's when the switch is on. But basically, whenever you're off the bike or not racing, you should almost take the perspective of just being almost risk averse. Not totally averse to risk, but very, very cautious. And if you watch the podcast, there's a bit in the middle of that where we talk about things that you would listen to and go, that's just pedantic. Like only using sealed water bottles was one of the examples that we do in the team I work with. But it sounds really pedantic, but being risk averse off the bike just saves those silly mistakes from happening. Yeah.
We've got a road one. I'm hoping we're going to get time to go through all of these, but we may not. So I'm going to go to the next one, which is road. So can you see Mark Kesheringham's one there, Ben?
Yeah.
So cornering on ice, likelihood 3 in the winter, risk rating 3-4, avoid by training inside when ice is possible outside. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. We'll move on from that one. So that's a good one, Mark. And I think, again, I was always told as a young rider, because I was once upon a time young, that there are two things you don't ride in, and that's ice and fog. And when you think about it, actually, on the road, that makes total sense, doesn't it? Yeah. So, and in actual fact, in times when I crashed in training races, in training, it's normally been in the winter and it's normally been on ice. And I was lucky because, once or twice, in hospital that afternoon, getting a few stitches, but that could easily be a collarbone, or worse. And actually a friend of mine crashed on the ice, and he was coming up to a junction, and he was stopping at that T-junction, and he was moving at maybe like 2 kilometers an hour as he was coming to a stop, and his front wheel just hit a patch of ice. He was basically going at walking speed. He hit some ice, and he broke his hip in 2 places. He was off the bike for about 6 months, 7 months. Yeah, and that's just like one silly little patch of ice, and going at the same speed as you would be walking. So when we talk about things that have a massive impact on your career, it's this. It's this. Let's have a look. Ollie has got extreme winds, likelihood, stormy weather. Okay. Using shallow wheels. Okay, that's a good one. We've got one here about cars. This is interesting. So I'm just going to send you. Have you got a picture from Stefan Hunt?
No, I'm only down to Oliver here.
Okay, let me grab this one because this is a very interesting one. Because cars are a perennial problem. So you got it?
From Stefan, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you make of this then, Ben?
So cars coming down the other side of the road during an open road race.
Racing on the open road, yeah.
Okay, so this is where we get in a bit more detail. There's risks that you can directly control, and there's risks that you cannot control, in a sense. So risks you can't control is things that other people do, basically. But the way we deal with them is by making some decisions to mitigate that risk by reducing the likelihood, i.e. eliminate it at the source, for example, not riding on busy roads, or reducing the consequence. So something like a car coming down the other side of the road is unfortunately a risk that you don't control. You'd like to think in an open road race there would be some controls, but this is the best piece of advice I've ever seen, and you won't have heard the end of it while we were in Tenerife, is don't cross the white lines on the other side of the road, especially in an open road race. In general, unless it's a totally closed road circuit or race, road and road closure, you shouldn't even really be near the white line. Someone in Tenerife who came to Tenerife can probably tell us why. So not going over the white line is a good strategy, but why should we not be near it? Let's see if anyone can remember that. And Nick will have to tell me if anyone puts them in the chat.
So that's a question that you guys can put in the chat now. So why would we be taking unnecessary risk or unacceptable, intolerable risk by riding near the white line? So we're talking about the white line down the middle of the road on a descent off of a mountain. Just while we're waiting for anyone to add something there. Unfortunately, I can give you a horrific example of what happens when you cross the white line in an open road race. And it was actually a race I was due to be riding, but I was invited to a christening party instead, and I thought, well, do you know what? I'd rather go to a christening party than do this race. It was at a point where I was losing motivation, to be honest. And in that race, a rider had crossed the white line on a descent and went straight into the path of an oncoming car, and it killed him instantly. And so, I mean, this is where assessing risk goes beyond the impact on your career, and it's your existence. Because cycling is getting faster and faster. I think all disciplines of cycling are getting faster, and so this is, I just wish this unit was not called risk assessment, because it sounds like Ben says, it sounds like something that people do in offices, but it's kind of like, it would be better called like staying alive, because it's, the speed now of cycling is, athletes are faster, bikes are better. So your ability to risk assess needs to be even better. Okay. Right, Ben, we've got some examples. So let me just read those out to you. Right, Harrison has said, in case a car comes over the line, especially on a corner, yeah. Emily, if buses or large vehicles come around the corner, they will go on the other side of the road. So I think what Emily means there is that a bus being that much longer, the front of the bus, it goes beyond where the wheels are. So the wheels of the bus might be on the correct side of the road, but the front of the bus, the overhanging part of the bus, is halfway across the lane that we're in. And if you're in that part of the lane, you can't slow down as quickly as a car can, because you're on a push bike with even with disc brakes, you can't slow down that quickly, and so it's very, very likely that you're going to be going into the front of that bus. Stefan, large vehicles like buses or lorries may cross over the white line. Yeah, and they do, because they need to, especially on hairpin bends. Georgia Mahoney, in case cars come over the line around the corner. Charlie Brennan, it's important to stay on the correct side of the road because cars sometimes may go onto the white line if going around a corner or even on a tight lane. So I think people seem to be tuned into this pretty well. Ben, what would you say?
Yeah, definitely. I guess this moves away from, doesn't totally move away from assessing risk, but just general advice for anyone who's slightly less experienced on the road. Everyone in Tenerife will have seen this firsthand. But I guess until you start to learn to drive, which some of you may well be doing, you don't totally understand how some drivers behave on the road. So what I was saying about being slightly risk averse when you're not racing means there are some risks that are just hardline intolerable for you, no matter what anybody else around you on the road is doing. Maybe you're riding with mates who are crossing the white line on a training ride. For you, there should be certain risks that are just intolerable, like you are not willing to do them, because unfortunately, in this day and age, you have to sort of assume everybody else on the road is incompetent. They're not, but if you assume every driver is looking at the phone or is distracted or isn't between the white lines, then it means you will be ready for the one that is unfortunately actually doing that. So preempt the risk. Don't wait for it to happen. Preempt it, because we know our brains can handle things that they've run through in advance rather than being reactive.
So we've got time for one more example, and Keishu, can you open up your mic, please? Because I said that we would get your contribution from like a verbal contribution. So Keishu, what have you got in terms of your risk assessment for Ben to assess?
On what likelihood was it?
What? Sorry, what was the first of all? What was the what
so
was the?
I put the possible crash on the corner by sliding out, and it was 3 to 5. It was tolerable, so it might put you out, but hopefully not too bad if it's like a wet surface or a corner. It just depends whereabouts the other riders are on the track.
Okay, what was the discipline? Which cycling discipline?
Oh, it was BMX.
Right, got it. Okay. So, cornering on BMX on a track, yeah?
Yeah, it was on the track.
Okay. So you got to a risk rating of 5. Just explain to me how you got to that risk rating of 5 again. I didn't quite understand it.
I got to the rating of, it was between 3 to 5 because it's unlikely to know what is going to happen on the corner. So you could be leading, slide out, and have 7 other riders land on you, or you could be the last and slide out and come off with a few scratches or just a bit of like a tarmac burn.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the likelihood.
Put it as,
yeah. So the likelihood.
5.
Right. Okay. So likelihood was 2. So that must mean that the severity was. Well, a 2 as well then, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So here's a question to, I want to start to put this into like a tactical context. Let's say it like that in a race. So a question for you, Pashu, is what might increase the likelihood? And I want you to think about, you may have knowledge or awareness of the skills of the riders around you in that specific race. I.e., the people that are beside you in the gate, you know what their capabilities are. How might that affect how likely it is for someone to slide out in the corner?
I feel like it might maybe increase it, because if a lot of people are around the same level, as all 8 people go off at the same time, I think because everyone's so close together, I think the likelihood becomes a lot higher because it's more competitive. So more people are aiming for the most inside line as possible and could slide out more. It'll be more likely to slide out instead of if it was an easier race.
Yeah, exactly. One more question, only because this is a really good example. If, let's say, you know that coming into the first corner, there is a rider who's made it in front of you. This rider is notorious for sliding out and crashing all the time. So the likelihood is higher. How are you going to reduce the risk? If you are about to follow them into the corner, what might you do?
I feel like I would take more caution, maybe take a little bit of a higher line. If I know they've got a reputation for sliding out, I'd be a little bit more cautious if I was behind them. So I'd make sure that I'd take a higher line or stay a little bit more behind them and catch up maybe on the straight instead of a corner.
Yeah, that is exactly what I was going for. So this applies to everybody across all disciplines, right? Using this as a tactical tool, right? You may think, I am the only one who controls how risky something is, but there's no point taking that attitude when, for example, you know the rider in front of you will crash or is highly likely to crash because they're not as technically able as you, for example. This is where you can then make a tactical decision, like Kaishu said, to take a slightly different line, or mountain bike, you might ride the B line even if they're taking the A line, because it's more of an acceptable level of risk. So this is how you can leverage risk assessment to make the bike go faster overall by basically, having your head on a swivel, which not all riders do. Everyone's capable of it, but having this awareness of risk and employing it tactically is, that's what's going to win races. So excellent example.
All right. Okay. We're not going to have time to go for any more examples, unfortunately, and there are some great ones on here that we haven't covered. But what you guys can do, so those guys who we've not done any feedback on, so you can use those examples in your workbook. In fact, you can all use the examples that you've given us in your workbooks. In your workbooks, you're required to identify about 3 or 4, okay? So we need about 3 or 4 examples of what you guys have just gone through, okay? And it's really important that those examples are specific to your discipline, because it's about you, okay? So, if you're BMX, we want to see BMX examples. If you're downhill, we want to see downhill examples. If you're track examples, okay? Because otherwise it's completely pointless. And that, for this to be effective, for this to actually have an impact on kind of protecting, prolonging, maximizing your cycling career, then you need to be reflective in terms of like your own experiences. Okay, so we want a really, really personalized level of information on your workbooks on this. Okay, all right. So we can now do the following. So now we can now recognize common risks that we would encounter. We can evaluate them using our mental assessment framework, and all that mental assessment framework is basically going through those processes that Ben's been explaining to us, not just on paper, but also kind of mentally, because as Ben has been, reminding us, risk assessment as a bike rider is continuous. It's dynamic. It's not a one-time piece of paper that you do and then think, right, okay, I'm now ready to descend this mountain. Okay, you're continually revisiting that risk assessment in your head. And then lastly, applying strategies. And that great example there from Cashew at the end was about, how, you might do that kind of, from a kind of race strategy perspective as well. Okay. So great session tonight. And that brings us to the end. Before we go, Ben, I just want to say thanks for such a brilliant session, because I know risk assessment is something that's integral to a lot of the other things that you do in your work, especially when it comes to things like leading expeditions and organizing expeditions. So guys, we're really lucky tonight, that Ben's on here, because, he's, an expert in, leading groups and, in lots of different environments as well. And Ben's been out with us 4 times on the Tenerife trips. In fact, he's done every single one of the Tenerife trips. And, the impact that he has is massive. So we're really, really lucky to get Ben on here tonight. So Ben, on behalf of everybody, thanks for joining us. I hope, fingers crossed, that we can get you back on for something else. Okay. But also, Ben, where do people find you on your socials before we finish?
You can follow my business account, which is scaife.cc.
Scaife.cc. So that was the one I put on the first slide. Okay, so give Ben a follow, because he's a content creator as well. He creates some great stuff on Instagram, like all of the interesting stuff that you saw on Instagram from our Tenerife trip was filmed by Ben. All of the boring stuff was filmed by me. So there's a complete difference in skill sets. But I was learning. I think I was doing quite a good job of learning though, Ben. Would you say so?
Oh, excellent. Yeah.
You're bound to say that. Right. Let's wrap it up. So guys, let's finish up there. Thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone for joining tonight, and get those workbooks done and dusted, because the handing date is imminent. And then we can assess those and then move on. So yeah, nice one. Thanks guys. Cheers Ben. Cheers everybody.